He had already escaped. He could have lived. But 3 seconds later, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago dove back into the freezing river for a woman everyone else would have left behind. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe courage is measured by what we do for others, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, back to Dominic Castellano. The black SUV vanished beneath the surface of the Fox River with a groan of twisting metal and a burst of silver bubbles. Rain hammered the water above like thousands of tiny drums, turning the night into a blur of darkness and reflected headlights. Dominic Castellano broke through the surface, gasping for air. The river was colder than he expected, shocking his lungs and sending pain through every muscle in his body. For a brief moment, instinct took over. Survive. Breathe. Stay above water. Around him, security vehicles screeched to a halt along the riverbank. Men shouted his name through the storm. Flashlights danced across the black water. Someone was already throwing a rescue rope. Dominic wiped rain from his eyes and turned toward the shore. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it almost disappeared beneath the thunder. Tap, tap, tap. He froze. At first he thought it was his imagination. The river was roaring around him. Wind bent the trees along the embankment. Water surged over the submerged vehicle below. Yet there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Desperate. Weak. Running out of time. Dominic looked down into the dark water. 20 feet below, the rear lights of the SUV glowed like distant red stars fading into another world. The vehicle was sinking deeper every second. One of his men yelled from shore. "Boss, swim this way." Dominic didn't move, because he knew exactly who was still inside. Naomi Carter, the quiet housemaid who had worked at his estate for less than a year. The woman most people barely noticed when she entered a room. The woman who somehow made his 10-year-old son smile on the worst days. The woman who always seemed to put everyone else's pain ahead of her own. Another flash of lightning split the sky. For an instant, the river illuminated beneath him. Through the cracked side window, he thought he saw movement. A hand. Then darkness swallowed everything again. Dominic's jaw tightened. Every survival instinct screamed at him to keep swimming. The vehicle was unstable. The current was growing stronger. The temperature alone could kill a man within minutes. He had already escaped. He had already beaten the odds. Then he remembered Naomi's laugh echoing through the mansion kitchen while Wyatt showed her one of his drawings. He remembered the way she listened when his son spoke, as if every word mattered. He remembered something else too. Earlier that evening, just before the storm began, Naomi had smiled and told Wyatt she would always keep him safe. Dominic stared into the black water below. The tapping had stopped. That frightened him more than the storm. Along the shoreline, his security team continued shouting. The rescue rope floated only yards away. Safety was right there. Life was right there. But Dominic Castellano was no longer looking at the shore. He took one final breath, filled his lungs with icy air, and without saying a single word, disappeared beneath the surface for the second dive. 3 months earlier, Naomi Carter had been the kind of person most people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. She moved quietly through the enormous Castellano estate before sunrise, carrying fresh linens down marble hallways and polishing surfaces that reflected crystal chandeliers worth more than the house where she had grown up on Chicago's South Side. The mansion seemed designed to remind people of their place. Wealth towered from every corner. Security guards stood at every entrance. Expensive artwork lined the walls. Yet Naomi never appeared intimidated by any of it. She simply did her work with the same calm focus she brought to everything else in her life. The other staff often wondered how she stayed so cheerful. None of them knew she spent most evenings working a second job remotely to help cover medical expenses for her grandmother. None of them knew she slept barely 5 hours a night. And none of them knew how many times she quietly skipped buying things for herself so someone she loved could have what they needed. If Naomi carried burdens, she carried them silently. Dominic Castellano noticed none of this at first. Why would he? Hundreds of people worked across his businesses and properties. Employees came and went every year. Most never held his attention longer than a few seconds. Naomi should have been no different. Then Wyatt entered the picture. Dominic's 10-year-old son had not spoken much since losing his mother several years earlier. The boy preferred silence over conversation and books over people. Entire rooms could fill with guests. and Wyatt would disappear into a corner with a sketchpad and headphones. Specialists had offered advice. Tutors had come and gone. Therapists had tried their best. Nothing seemed to reach him consistently. Then one afternoon, Dominic walked past the sunroom and stopped. Wyatt was laughing. Not smiling politely. Not pretending. Actually laughing. The sound was so rare that Dominic thought he had imagined it. Through the glass doors, he saw Naomi sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his son. She was helping him build a miniature city from cardboard boxes that had been waiting for recycling. There was no expensive technology involved. No educational program. No special strategy. Just patience. Wyatt was explaining every building while Naomi listened as though he were presenting plans for the most important city in America. Dominic stood there longer than he intended. Neither of them noticed him. That became a pattern. A week later, he found Naomi helping Wyatt plant tomatoes in the greenhouse. Another day, she sat beside him during a thunderstorm, calmly distracting him with stories about growing up with her cousins during summer vacations. Somehow she always knew exactly what the boy needed. More surprisingly, she never seemed aware that Dominic was watching. Most people behaved differently around him. They became nervous or eager to impress. Naomi did neither. She treated him respectfully, but never acted intimidated. One evening, Dominic overheard Wyatt speaking to her in the library. "Why are you always nice to everybody?" the boy asked. Naomi smiled as she organized books onto a shelf. "Because everybody is carrying something you cannot see." Wyatt considered this carefully. "Even mean people?" Naomi nodded. "Especially them sometimes." Dominic remained hidden in the hallway, unexpectedly affected by the answer. For reasons he could not explain, those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. At the time, he believed Naomi was simply a good employee, a kind person, nothing more. He had no idea that very soon, she would become impossible to ignore. The first time Dominic Castellano realized Naomi Carter was changing something inside his home, it happened on a Sunday morning that began like any other. The mansion was unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the lake, and most of the staff were moving through their routines without urgency. Dominic had spent the previous 12 hours handling business matters that seemed endless, and by the time he entered the kitchen, he wanted nothing more than a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of silence. Instead, he found Wyatt sitting at the large wooden table with a notebook open in front of him. That alone was unusual. Normally, his son preferred isolation during breakfast. What caught Dominic's attention even more was Naomi sitting across from him. She was not speaking. She was simply listening. Wyatt was explaining something about a sketch he had been working on for weeks. Most adults would have nodded politely and moved on. Naomi studied every page as though she were reviewing blueprints for a skyscraper. "The bridge has to curve here," Wyatt explained. "Otherwise the traffic flow would not work." Naomi leaned closer. "Then I think you are right. The curve makes more sense." Wyatt smiled. It was a small smile, but Dominic noticed it immediately. He noticed everything when it came to his son. For years, happiness had arrived in brief moments before disappearing again. Yet lately those moments seemed to happen more often. And somehow Naomi was always nearby when they did. Dominic poured coffee and remained by the counter longer than necessary. Neither of them seemed aware of his presence. There was something genuine about the way Naomi interacted with Wyatt. She never spoke down to him. She never treated him like a problem to solve. She simply accepted him exactly as he was. Later that afternoon, Dominic found himself thinking about her words from the library. "Everybody is carrying something you cannot see." The sentence refused to leave his mind. He had spent most of his life judging people by actions, loyalty, and results. Yet Naomi looked beyond all of that. She saw struggles nobody else noticed. A few days later, Dominic arrived home much earlier than expected. The mansion staff scrambled slightly at his surprise appearance. Naomi did not. She was kneeling beside an elderly groundskeeper named Harold near the greenhouse. Harold had worked on the estate for over 20 years. Age had slowed him down recently, and some employees had quietly begun treating him as though he were no longer useful. Naomi sat beside him holding a notebook. "Show me again," she said. Harold pointed toward a row of flowers. "Those were planted by Mrs. Castellano 15 years ago." Naomi listened carefully as he shared story after story. Dominic watched from a distance. Most people in the mansion barely noticed Harold anymore. Naomi treated him like someone important. That evening, Dominic reviewed security footage from the property, searching for details related to an unrelated matter. By chance, he saw Naomi helping a delivery driver carry supplies through heavy rain. Another clip showed her leaving food for a stray dog near the back gate. Another showed her carrying groceries into the staff residence for an employee recovering from surgery. None of these acts were dramatic. None were performed for recognition. In fact, Naomi seemed determined to avoid attention altogether. Yet the more Dominic observed, the more impossible it became to ignore a simple truth. Kindness followed her the way shadows followed sunlight. And for the first time in years, Dominic found himself looking forward to seeing someone walk through the front door of his home. The warning arrived on a Wednesday evening disguised as something completely ordinary. Dominic was finishing a meeting in his private study when his head of security, Michael Reynolds, entered without knocking. That never happened unless something was wrong. Michael placed a tablet on the desk. Several photographs appeared on the screen. Vehicles parked near company properties. Unknown individuals entering restaurants owned by the Castellano organization. Repeated sightings near the estate. None of it was alarming on its own. Together, however, it formed a pattern. Dominic studied the images in silence. "How long?" he finally asked. "About 3 weeks," Michael replied. "We thought it was routine surveillance at first." Dominic leaned back in his chair. Outside the study windows, the sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the water in shades of gold and copper. Normally, he found the view calming. Tonight it felt distant. And now? Michael hesitated. "Now I think somebody is paying very close attention to your schedule." The room grew quiet. Dominic had lived long enough to recognize danger before it announced itself. The problem was uncertainty. He did not know who was watching. He did not know why. More importantly, he did not know what they were waiting for. For the next several days, security around the estate increased. Routes changed. Meetings were moved. Vehicles rotated. Most residents never noticed. Naomi certainly was not supposed to notice. Yet on Friday afternoon, she accidentally stepped into a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had been delivering fresh towels to the guest wing when voices drifted through a partially open office door. Michael's voice sounded unusually tense. "The weather forecast predicts severe storms all weekend. Visibility will be terrible." Another man answered. "That makes movement easier." Naomi froze for a moment. She was not trying to eavesdrop. She immediately continued walking. But one sentence lingered in her mind. "That makes movement easier." Later that evening, she noticed something else. Security personnel who usually worked inside were now stationed near entrances. Vehicles were being inspected twice before leaving the property. The atmosphere felt different. Not frightening exactly, just heavier, as though everyone were waiting for news that had not arrived yet. Meanwhile, Wyatt remained blissfully unaware. He sat in the library drawing new designs for his imaginary city, while Naomi helped organize books nearby. Rain tapped softly against the windows. "Do you think storms are scary?" Wyatt suddenly asked. Naomi glanced toward the darkening sky. "Sometimes." Wyatt continued sketching. "I like them. They remind me that everything eventually passes." Naomi smiled. "That is surprisingly wise for a 10-year-old. Wyatt shrugged. "My dad says fear gets stronger when you run from it." Naomi thought about that long after the conversation ended. Hours later, as she prepared to leave for the night, Dominic unexpectedly appeared in the foyer. He looked tired. Not physically tired. Burdened. The difference was subtle, but Naomi noticed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Dominic looked toward the windows where distant lightning flickered beyond the lake. "Big storm coming," he said. Naomi nodded. "Looks that way." Dominic studied her expression for a second longer than necessary, almost as if he wanted to say something else. Instead, he simply turned and walked away. Neither of them knew that within 48 hours, the approaching storm would change both of their lives forever. Sunday arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Thick clouds rolled across northern Illinois from dawn, swallowing the sun and casting long shadows across the Castellano estate. By noon, weather alerts flashed across phones throughout the city. Heavy rain, strong winds, limited visibility. Most people chose to stay home. Dominic Castellano did not have that luxury. An urgent matter required him to travel to a secure property nearly 70 miles outside Chicago. Under normal circumstances, the trip would have been postponed. These were not normal circumstances. Shortly after lunch, Dominic stood in the main foyer reviewing updates with Michael Reynolds. Security plans had been adjusted 3 separate times that morning. Routes changed, drivers reassigned, vehicles inspected. The precautions only deepened Dominic's suspicion that someone was still watching. Then an unexpected complication appeared. Wyatt came downstairs carrying his sketchbook. "I want to go with you," he announced. Dominic immediately shook his head. "Not today." Wyatt frowned. "You said we could visit the lake cabin before school starts again." Dominic glanced toward the windows where rain streaked across the glass. The boy was right. He had made that promise weeks earlier. Before Dominic could answer, Naomi entered carrying a stack of folded laundry. Wyatt turned toward her instantly. "Tell him." Naomi looked confused. "Tell him what?" "That he works too much." For the first time that day, Dominic almost smiled. Almost. Naomi tried not to laugh. "I think that is a discussion between you two." Wyatt crossed his arms. "You always make him listen." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Naomi looked embarrassed. "I do not think anyone makes you do anything, sir." The moment was brief, but it softened something in the room. 10 minutes later, Dominic made a decision. Wyatt would come. The trip would be short. Security would travel with them. They would leave before the weather became worse. Then another problem emerged. One of Wyatt's tutors canceled unexpectedly, leaving important materials that needed to be reviewed during the drive. Without hesitation, Wyatt pointed at Naomi. "She should come too." Dominic looked at her. Naomi immediately shook her head. "I am sure someone else would be better." "Please," Wyatt said. "You explain things better than anybody." Dominic studied both of them. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. "Pack what you need," he said finally. "We leave in 20 minutes. Naomi hesitated. Something felt wrong. She could not explain it. The air seemed heavier than usual. The sky darker. Even the estate appeared unusually quiet. Yet refusing was not really an option. Less than half an hour later, they departed. Dominic sat in the rear passenger seat reviewing documents while Wyatt sketched beside him. Naomi occupied the third row, helping organize notes for the boys' upcoming classes. 2 security vehicles followed behind. Rain intensified as they traveled north. Sheets of water swept across the highway. Wind rocked the SUV occasionally. Headlights blurred into long streaks against the wet pavement. For the first hour, everything remained calm. Wyatt eventually fell asleep with his sketchbook resting against his chest. Naomi glanced out the window and noticed a dark vehicle several car lengths behind the convoy. At first it seemed ordinary. Then she realized it had remained there for nearly 20 miles. The same distance. The same position. She leaned forward slightly. Something cold settled in her stomach. Up ahead, lightning illuminated the highway for a fraction of a second. And in that brief flash, she noticed another vehicle waiting near the next exit ramp. Naomi could not explain why her heart suddenly began racing. The vehicle near the exit ramp remained stationary until the convoy approached. Then, almost casually, it pulled onto the highway. The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Castellano," she said softly. Dominic looked up from the documents in his hands. "What is it?" Naomi glanced through the rain-covered window. "I think we have been followed for a while." Dominic's expression did not change, but his eyes immediately shifted toward the road ahead. Michael Reynolds was traveling in the lead security vehicle and appeared to notice something at the same moment. Through the windshield, Naomi saw brake lights flash briefly between the convoy vehicles. A silent signal. Dominic reached for his phone. Before he could make the call, a sudden burst of lightning illuminated the entire highway. For one bright second, the world turned silver. Rain, guardrails, trees bending in the wind, multiple vehicles surrounding them. Then darkness returned. The storm intensified almost instantly. Sheets of rain crashed against the windshield so heavily that visibility dropped to only a few yards. The driver tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Wyatt stirred awake and rubbed his eyes. "What is happening?" he asked sleepily. Naomi forced a reassuring smile. "Just a storm, sweetheart." Another flash of lightning. Another rumble of thunder. The road ahead curved toward a bridge crossing the Fox River. Water churned beneath it, swollen from days of heavy rain. Dominic's phone suddenly buzzed. A message appeared from Michael. "Change route immediately. Something feels wrong." Dominic read it once and looked forward. Unfortunately, there was no longer room to change routes. Traffic had compressed around them from every direction. Nothing appeared openly threatening. Yet the situation felt increasingly unnatural. The lead security vehicle accelerated slightly. The SUV carrying Dominic followed. Rainwater pooled across the bridge surface. The tires hissed against the pavement. Then everything happened at once. A strong gust of wind slammed across the bridge. The driver reacted instantly, maintaining control, but the slick roadway offered little forgiveness. Water sprayed across the windshield. Visibility disappeared completely for a terrifying second. Someone shouted through the driver's radio. The message dissolved into static. The SUV shifted sideways. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough for everyone inside to feel it. Wyatt grabbed Naomi's hand. Dominic immediately reached forward. "Stay calm," the driver corrected. The vehicle straightened. Relief lasted less than a second. Another patch of standing water appeared beneath the tires. The SUV began sliding again, this time farther. The world outside tilted at an impossible angle. Naomi heard the sound of rain, tires, and distant voices blending together. Wyatt's frightened eyes locked onto hers. Instinctively, she pulled him closer. Dominic saw it and moved immediately. "Wyatt." The vehicle spun. The bridge lights became streaks of gold and white. Everything felt weightless. Then came a sudden splash unlike anything Naomi had ever heard. Cold darkness exploded around them. Water surged against the windows. The SUV had left the roadway and entered the river below. For one frozen moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The vehicle floated in eerie silence beneath the storm. Then Naomi looked outside and realized the impossible truth. They were sinking. Cold river water pressed against every window as the SUV drifted deeper beneath the surface. The interior lights flickered once and then disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of the dashboard. Naomi's pulse thundered in her ears. Water seeped through the edges of the doors, rising inch by inch across the floor. Wyatt's small hand gripped hers tightly. The boy was trembling, but he was trying not to panic. Dominic immediately took control. His voice remained calm despite the impossible situation. "Listen to me. Everyone stay focused." The driver was already working to unlock the doors, but the pressure outside held them shut. Water continued climbing higher. Naomi could feel the cold spreading through her legs. Outside the windows, the river looked endless and black. Dominic moved toward Wyatt first. Nothing mattered more than his son. He loosened the boy's seatbelt and pulled him close. "Look at me," he said firmly. Wyatt obeyed. "You are going to be okay. Do you understand?" Wyatt nodded, though fear filled his eyes. Another surge of water entered the cabin. The level reached their waists. The vehicle groaned softly as it settled deeper into the river. Dominic knew they had only moments before the pressure equalized enough for a door to open. Every second felt like an hour. Naomi forced herself to stay calm for Wyatt's sake. She remembered every conversation they had shared in the library, every drawing he had proudly shown her, every small victory he had celebrated. She could not let him see her afraid. "Remember what you told me about storms?" she asked gently. Wyatt swallowed hard. "Everything eventually passes." Naomi managed a smile. "That is right." Dominic glanced toward her. Even now, she was comforting his son before thinking about herself. The realization struck him with unexpected force. Water reached their chests. The air inside the SUV felt smaller with every breath. Finally, a loud click echoed through the cabin. The pressure had begun to equalize. Dominic immediately pushed against the rear passenger door. It moved slightly. Hope flashed through the darkness. "Again," he said. Together he and the driver pushed. This time the door opened. River water rushed through the opening. The current pulled at everything inside the vehicle. Dominic wrapped one arm around Wyatt and guided him toward the exit. Security personnel had already reached the surface above. Flashlights cut through the dark water like distant stars. Naomi watched as Dominic carried Wyatt toward the opening. Relief flooded through her. The boy was going to survive. Then something unexpected happened. As she shifted forward, her foot caught beneath a twisted section of the seat frame. She pulled once. Nothing happened. She tried again. The metal refused to release her. Her heart dropped. More water rushed into the cabin. Dominic pushed Wyatt upward toward safety. The driver followed. For a brief second, Naomi thought she could free herself. Then the vehicle shifted again, settling deeper into the riverbed. The movement trapped her more securely than before. She looked toward the opening. Dominic had reached the surface with Wyatt. Rescue teams were already helping them. Naomi tugged desperately against the obstruction. It would not move. Cold exhaustion began creeping through her body. Above her, the fading light seemed impossibly far away. Then she saw Dominic break the surface. For one moment he was safe. He had his son. He had survived. Anyone would have understood if he stayed there. Instead, Dominic turned back toward the dark water. And without hesitation, he dove beneath the surface again. The river swallowed Dominic the moment he dove beneath the surface. The cold struck like a wall, but he ignored it. Above him, voices shouted from the shoreline. Rescue crews called his name. Michael Reynolds was already trying to organize another search team. None of it mattered. Dominic's focus remained fixed on the fading shape of the SUV below. The vehicle's rear lights glowed weakly through the dark water, growing dimmer with every second. He pushed downward with powerful strokes. His lungs already burned from the first escape, but he forced himself deeper. Inside the SUV, Naomi's strength was fading. She continued pulling at her trapped foot, but the twisted metal refused to move. Water filled every corner of the cabin. The remaining pocket of air was disappearing. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought of her grandmother. She thought of the tiny apartment where she had grown up. She thought of Wyatt's proud smile whenever he completed a new drawing. Strangely, she was not thinking about herself. She was wondering whether Wyatt would blame himself for what had happened. Then movement appeared beyond the window. Naomi opened her eyes. At first she thought she was imagining it. A shadow emerged through the darkness. Then she recognized him. Dominic. He had come back. Her eyes widened in disbelief. He should have been safe. He should have stayed with his son. Yet there he was, fighting the current to reach her. Dominic reached the vehicle and grabbed the door frame. The current pulled against him relentlessly. He peered inside and immediately saw the problem. Naomi was trapped. Their eyes met through the murky water. For one suspended moment, neither looked away. Naomi shook her head slightly. It was a silent message. Go. Save yourself. Dominic's response was immediate. He ignored it completely. He reached inside and examined the obstruction holding her foot. The metal had bent during the crash, creating a narrow trap around her ankle. Dominic pulled once. Nothing happened. He adjusted his position and tried again. The metal shifted slightly, but still held. His lungs screamed for air. Every instinct told him to return to the surface. Instead, he remained. Naomi watched him with growing shock. Nobody had ever fought this hard for her before. Not because they had to. Not because they were paid to. Simply because her life mattered to them. Dominic braced himself and pulled again. This time the metal finally gave way. Naomi felt the pressure release around her ankle. Relief flashed across her face. Dominic immediately guided her toward the opening. But the effort had cost precious seconds. His movements were slower now. The surface seemed impossibly far above them. Naomi realized what was happening. Without hesitation, she grabbed his arm and pointed upward. Together they kicked toward the faint light overhead. The river felt endless. Darkness surrounded them on every side. Then suddenly a powerful beam from a rescue spotlight pierced the water. The surface was closer than before. Much closer. Naomi pushed forward with everything she had left. Beside her, Dominic continued swimming despite obvious exhaustion. Finally, they broke through the surface together. Air, rain, shouts, light. The river exploded with activity around them. Rescue crews rushed forward. Michael Reynolds nearly collapsed with relief. On the shoreline, Wyatt stood wrapped in a blanket, his eyes searching desperately through the storm. The moment he saw Naomi and his father emerge from the water, tears filled his eyes. And as Dominic looked toward his son and then back toward Naomi, a truth settled into his heart with undeniable clarity. The fear he had felt beneath that river had not been about dying. It had been about losing her. 3 days later, sunlight finally returned to Chicago. The storm had moved east, leaving behind clear skies and streets washed clean by rain. Inside St. Joseph Medical Center, however, time seemed to move differently. Dominic Castellano had barely left the hospital since the accident. He attended necessary calls. He reviewed urgent reports. He handled responsibilities that could not wait. Yet every few hours he found himself returning to the same room on the 4th floor. Naomi remained asleep for most of those 3 days. Doctors assured everyone that she would recover. Even so, Dominic stayed nearby. Nurses began recognizing him. Security guards stopped asking questions. One nurse joked that he spent more time there than some hospital employees. Dominic did not laugh. He simply pulled a chair closer to the window and continued waiting. On the morning of the fourth day, Naomi finally opened her eyes. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of activity in the hallway. For several seconds, she stared at the ceiling, trying to understand where she was. Then she noticed someone sitting beside the window. Dominic immediately stood. Relief crossed his face so quickly that he could not hide it. "Good morning," he said softly. Naomi blinked. "How long have I been here?" "For days." Her eyes widened slightly. "For days?" Dominic nodded. "The doctors wanted to make sure you recovered fully." Naomi looked around the room and then back at him. "You stayed?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, he searched for an answer. Finally, he gave the only honest one he had. "Yes." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that exists when two people suddenly understand something important without needing many words. Later that afternoon, Michael Reynolds arrived with new information. Investigators had completed their preliminary review. The accident had not been random. Evidence suggested someone had intentionally manipulated conditions surrounding the convoy's route. The discovery confirmed Dominic's earlier suspicions. Someone had been watching. Someone had been planning. Michael expected anger. He expected immediate orders. Instead, Dominic surprised him. "Handle it legally," he said. Michael stared. "That is all." Dominic glanced through the hospital room window where Naomi was speaking with Wyatt. The boy had spent the last hour showing her new sketches from his notebook. For the first time in days, both were smiling. "That is all," Dominic repeated. Michael understood then. Something had changed. The river had taken more than a vehicle that night. It had taken years of walls Dominic had built around himself. As evening approached, Wyatt finally left with his tutor. The room grew quiet again. Golden sunlight spilled across the floor. Naomi looked toward Dominic. "You should have stayed with your son." Dominic held her gaze. "I did." Naomi smiled faintly. "You know what I mean." He looked away for a second before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. More honest. More vulnerable. "When I surfaced that night, I thought the worst was over." Naomi listened carefully. Dominic's eyes met hers again. "Then I realized you were still down there." The room fell silent. Outside the window, the city moved on with its ordinary life. Inside that small hospital room, however, everything felt different. Dominic took a slow breath. "I thought I had lost you." Naomi did not speak immediately. She simply looked at him and understood exactly what those words had cost him to say. And in that quiet moment, neither of them needed anything else. Because that day, after storms, fear, and impossible choices, two lives had been changed forever. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.